Or you can.
To do it myself?
So that's the next slide there, and you'll see it up there as well. Thank you. I think we're back live now. Yes, we are. So welcome to this part of the evening. And for those of you who joined us during the service, welcome to all of you. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome our guest speaker for this evening's talk to mark Kristallnacht. Dr. Toby Simpson is director of the Vienna Holocaust Library. The library is the world's oldest archival and library connection relating to the Holocaust and Nazi era. Dr. Simpson has been in his current role since 2019. Previously, he led the project Testifying to the Truth, Eyewitnesses to the Holocaust, which has catalogued, digitized, and translated over 1,000 eyewitness accounts gathered by the Vienna Library between 1954 and 1961. Dr. Simpson joined the Vienna Library in 2011, setting up a new program of exhibitions, tours, and events. Between 2011 and 2016, he curated or co-curated over a dozen exhibitions, including Humanity After the Holocaust, the Jewish Relief Unit, 1943 to 1950, and 4,000 Lives, the Kitchener Camp Rescue. Dr. Simpson's talk this evening is entitled Kristallnacht in Vienna, the Radicalisation of Antisemitic Policy in the Nazi State. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Wright. It's a real honor and privilege to be here. And I want to also say thank you to everybody who gave a reading tonight. I feel very lucky to have been here to participate in such a moving and important service of remembrance. Thank you, everyone. I've been working at the Vienna Holocaust Library for 10 years, studying and writing about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And I've been engaging with this subject actually for the better part of 20 years, but occasions like today remind me that no matter how much I read, my understanding of those times pales in comparison to those who were there. And it's really sobering to listen to the readings from Yuan as someone who was an eyewitness. It reminds me of the value, the exceptional value of first-hand evidence. And the Vienna Holocaust Library is Britain's repository of first-hand evidence of the Holocaust, and it's a resource for the world, one of very few institutions of its kind. It's very precious for that reason. I hugely appreciate the support of the congregation at LJS towards the library. We have a wonderful relationship, and it was also a wonderful and important, memorable moment for the library to hold a memorial concert in this sanctuary, which we did for the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and Bob and Anne were candle lighters at that occasion. So it's bringing back many important memories for me this evening. So I've chosen for this evening's talk to discuss Kristallnacht in Vienna, which is a topic which reminds us of one of the most terrible atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime. And I've chosen it for a specific reason. One is to do with why I think the topic is important, and the other is to do with something that's happening at the library at the moment. The library, in partnership with the Austrian Cultural Forum, is hosting an exhibition about the way Nazi anti-Jewish policy was radicalized through policies implemented in Vienna, and this happened not just once, but on multiple occasions through the history of the Third Reich. It's a very eye-opening exhibition, and I would definitely encourage anyone who's interested in the subject to visit the library. It will be on until the middle of next February. But I also think the topic is important in itself, and I will explain why in a moment. But first, I want to come back to this importance of eyewitness testimony, first-hand evidence. Much of what I'm going to talk about this evening is based on the library's collections, and in particular on photographs and eyewitness accounts. And they really reveal, I think, the extreme brutality of violence during Kristallnacht in Vienna. I'm going to show a number of photos this evening. This one is from our collections, and it shows a bookshop which belonged to Hermann Tüchner, which was looted and smashed up during Kristallnacht in Vienna. And you can see the graffiti on the front of the shop, Ist in Dachau. This was intended to terrorize anyone walking by. And it's a vivid reminder of how it was violence inflicted upon individuals who were vulnerable and who suffered terribly. And so I wanted to begin by outlining what happened in Kristallnacht in Vienna, starting with some numbers which do reveal the scale of the brutality, but also reading out some words from an eyewitness account that is held in the library's collections. So, beginning on the night of the 9th of November in Vienna, more than 24 synagogues and as many as 100 prayer houses were attacked and desecrated, with the majority either burned to the ground or destroyed. More than 6,000 Jewish men were arrested. Over a dozen people were killed in the streets. Several dozen committed suicide. Dozens of shops were looted, like the shop in this photograph. But perhaps, as I said, even more revealing than the statistics is what people said at the time, people who experienced this. And I think it does come out in eyewitness accounts that even at the time, people who experienced Kristallnacht in Vienna felt that the violence in Vienna was exceptionally brutal. And I'm just going to read a quote. "Everything that is said about what happened in Vienna is untrue. It is underestimated 100-fold. There was no compassion, no mercy. What we saw was a brutish folk enraptured by the most intense sadism. Anyone who did not prostrate themselves when confronted by the police were punched or kicked. It was awful to see it. It was awful to hear the cries of pain. How many are dying or have perished already? I have no information. I was there, and what I'm reporting today only covers part of what happened." Now, what I'm not trying to do by highlighting the brutality of Kristallnacht in Vienna is to, in any way, set up a comparison with what happened elsewhere. And in a way, I also just want to remind everyone of the sheer scale of these attacks across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Each of these dots in this map, compiled by the Memorial de la Shoah in Paris, shows a town, a city, or a village in Germany where there was a recorded anti-Semitic attack, violence. And I think that what we can start to do is we can start to grasp the scale of this violence, and we can start to ask questions about how this was possible. And that's really what I want to do by highlighting what happened in Vienna. I think it's important to understand why the violence in Vienna does appear to have been exceptionally brutal. And just to illustrate that, although Vienna was the second largest city in the Reich. It was the city where there were the most arrests. So 6,000 men were arrested in Vienna compared to 3,000 in Berlin. 24 synagogues in Vienna were desecrated and destroyed. In Berlin, there were the handful of synagogues that were protected from destruction, and this didn't happen in Vienna. I think the reason to ask why is that it links actually to what Richard was reading about the lessons that we need to try to learn. We have a duty to try to prevent any kind of similar or comparable violence happening today. And unless we begin to understand the causes of extreme violence, then we have little chance of preventing it. So again, I want to begin with eyewitness accounts. When we go back to the evidence, how can we begin to understand why violence was particularly extreme in Vienna? And there are several reasons. I will need to unpack a few, but I do want to begin with eyewitness accounts. An important trigger point for Kristallnacht was a renewed threat of war. And an aspect of this which historians often point to is the Sudetenland crisis, which was namely Hitler's threat to invade Czechoslovakia in order to assert the rights of ethnic Germans living in borderland areas. And you can see on this map Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland is the part of the Czech lands between the two, which is in the slightly darker blue colour. And as part of the notorious Munich Agreement, in which Britain played a leading role, it was notoriously agreed to carve up Czech territory and hand the Sudetenland to Hitler. And this all the while failed to deter him at all from invading the whole of Bohemia and Moravia, which was done the following year in March. And a puppet government was also installed in Slovakia. And that's noted on this map. This is important context for Kristallnacht, and that comes through actually in eyewitness accounts. So I'm going to read again from an eyewitness account which talks about how this played into the context in Vienna. So this is written by an anonymous Jewish man in a report that was submitted to Alfred Vienna and his colleagues after Kristallnacht. In September, it appeared as if the Jewish question had been forgotten. Only at the end of that month did the issue of the Sudeten Germans bring fresh unrest, continuing the old harassments. In this, the Nazis were supported by the Viennese press, who at the beginning of October accused Jews of being warmongers. So an important aspect of the context of Kristallnacht was a Nazi regime that was portraying Jews as an enemy within, something that, again, is a pattern that we've seen in subsequent conflicts. At a time of mounting tension, this was a way that the Nazi regime attempted to escalate terror and to drive animosity towards Vienna's Jews. This is, of course, immediate context. It's important, but it's also relevant that there was a deeper history at play here. Indeed, a generation before, the Czech lands had been part of the very same dual monarchy and empire as Vienna, the Habsburg Empire. And this long history of Central European culture had anti-Semitism embedded within it. And that's another important thread of this history. And it must be said that Vienna had long nurtured in its politics anti-Semitic rhetoric. And here I would point to anti-Semitic politicians, populist politicians like Georg von Schönerer and Karl Lueger, who were pan-German nationalists and who, again, in their rabble-rousing rhetoric, attempted to paint Jews as the enemies of the German folk. This is something that had been embedded in Viennese political culture since the unification of Germany from the 1870s onwards, and it also had an important influence on Hitler during the years of his youth spent in Vienna. We could even argue that it's relevant to understanding the violence in Vienna that we need to go further back, perhaps even back into the history of the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, anti-Semitism was deeply embedded in medieval culture. In Vienna, in the year 1420, on the orders of the Habsburg Duke Albert V, almost the entire Jewish community of Vienna was attacked in a pogrom that resulted in the execution of 200 Jews. And in that same year, 1420, the entire community of 1,500 Jews in Vienna was entirely stripped of its property and expelled. In fact, this brutal medieval period of German history was celebrated by the Nazis as this imagined mythical First Reich in which the Germanic peoples were supposedly united in a single folk. And this was a Nazi propaganda postcard which was issued to commemorate the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany, just a few months before Kristallnacht. And it harked back to this mythical idea of some kind of golden age of Germany and Austria. I think propaganda postcards like this help us to understand that there was a high degree of popular enthusiasm for the Anschluss in Austria. This is a photograph of an SS cordon in front of an enthusiastic pro-Nazi crowd in Vienna at the time of the Anschluss. And of course, this is a propaganda image. It doesn't give the whole picture, but nevertheless, we do know there was a large degree of popular enthusiasm, and certainly nothing could be further from the truth than the myth that Austria was somehow Hitler's first victim. That's very much a distortion of history. So, we know that many Austrians enthusiastically greeted the Nazis. And it's tempting to infer from that that the violence during Kristallnacht was popular, that it was instigated by ordinary people who might have been inspired by this long history of anti-Semitism. But we need to be hesitant before we take that view, not least because that is precisely what the Nazis wanted people to believe. They wanted people to believe that Kristallnacht was a popular outburst of anti-Semitism. So that needs to give us pause before we come to that conclusion. And in fact, the evidence from eyewitness accounts doesn't bear it out. So I'm going to do another short reading from an eyewitness account in the Vienna Library's collections. This man said, "The violence was ordered by the Nazis. There's no evidence needed to show that the Viennese people would otherwise have been completely indifferent to Herr von Rath's assassination." This was the German diplomat who was assassinated and that was used by the Nazis as an excuse to trigger Kristallnacht. So in other words, this eyewitness is saying that the Viennese would not and did not rise up, and there was no popular outburst of violence. The violence of Kristallnacht was directed by the Nazis. It may be true that there was real enthusiasm for the Nazis in Vienna, but they do not explain the violence of Kristallnacht. For that, we need to look at the actions of the Nazis. And indeed, if we go back to the Anschluss, one of the things that was exceptional about Vienna was the speed and aggression with which the Nazis imposed anti-Jewish legislation in Austria from the time of the Anschluss onwards. And in fact, I was speaking to Ruth Sands today, who some of you may know. She's a child survivor who was born in Vienna. And she said she remembered that it was a common observation among people she knew that the Nazis did to the Jews in Austria in 6 months what it took them 6 years to do to the Jews in the rest of Germany. Anti-Jewish legislation was brought in extremely rapidly, and it had a huge impact on the Viennese Jewish community, which was, after Berlin, the largest and most economically vibrant and diverse in Central Europe. This is a photograph of Jewish men and women outside the Polish legation. It's on the 17th of March. This was just days after the Anschluss. This would not have happened if the Jews of Vienna were not aware of how terrible the situation was, and these men and women were desperate to find a way to leave. Why was this so? Well, after the Anschluss, it's not just the introduction of anti-Jewish legislation, there was an incredible brutality to anti-Jewish violence, even from those very first days after the annexation. And in particular, we are confronted with awful images like this of a Jewish woman who was forced to scrub pro-Austrian slogans off the streets. This was a campaign instigated by the Nazis of violence in response to Austrian nationalism. And the letters you can see are R and E. This is part of Österreich. It was any political expression of Austria's independence was a threat as far as the Nazis were concerned. And they used that as an opportunity to ritually humiliate the people, the Jewish population of Vienna. And again, I am going to turn to an eyewitness account which from the library's collection, which more than I could ever say suggests just how horrific this was. So an eyewitness reports, "No consideration was given for anyone's suffering. No concern was given for the women's clothing. They had to kneel on the street and wash with very caustic bleach. An acquaintance of my wife sustained such a serious injury to her knee that the flesh came off the bone, and after 3 months the wound is still clearly visible." Again, there's a power to that is. This was somebody who was writing while this woman her wound had still not healed. How was this possible? Why didn't the wider population intervene? Again, this comes back to the question posed in Richard's reading. This is not an easy question to answer, but we do need to remember the extent to which the purpose of these ritual humiliations on the part of the Nazis was to impose a regime of terror. Part of that was terrorizing the Jewish the Jewish community and all of its representative organizations. And there was an official Jewish community organization, and this photograph here shows Joseph Lovenhertz, who was actually did a huge amount of work to assist with emigration, but he did so under extreme duress. This is a picture of Adolf Eichmann and Herbert Hagen, who immediately arrested leaders of the Jewish community, imposed control on their activities, and there's a clear evidence that Viennese Jews were presented essentially with an impossible situation and with very rapid violence, including raids on synagogues. This was before Kristallnacht. And many did get out, both before and after Kristallnacht. So this is a photograph of the index card that the Jewish community organization compiled to assist with emigration, which is, within a very short space of time, they managed to gather the details of 118,000 people, without which it would have been impossible to organize a very rapid emigration of a very large number of people. And it is tragic that this documentation was subsequently abused by the Nazis in order to facilitate deportations. But before that, a very large number of people were successful in emigrating, over 100,000. And this graphic, which is part of the exhibition that's on display at the library, shows the main places of refuge that Viennese Jews found across the world. The situation, of course, became increasingly desperate, and fewer places took Jewish refugees over time. So, Another thing that I want to emphasize as I, again, focus on the activities of the Nazis and how that drove the brutality of Kristallnacht in Vienna. We saw Adolf Eichmann in the previous slide. He immediately took over, well, it took a while for the organization to be set up, but very rapidly took over this building in central Vienna, which became the central office for Jewish emigration. And it retained that name, even though it subsequently became, was more and more clearly a euphemism. I mean, it was a euphemism for the beginning, but it became the planning hub for deportations to the east, which from 1941 onwards was deportation to either ghettos and ultimately to death camps. So what I think we, again, need to understand is that an infrastructure was being established to systematically dispossess and terrorize and force out the Jewish population in Vienna. And this was happening with a degree of organization that was greater than anywhere else in the Reich at that time. And I wanted to show another item in our collections, which I found especially shocking and sinister and disturbing, and it speaks to what Eichmann was doing and why it was so insidious. This is a postcard which was delivered to homeowners in Vienna, owners of apartments in Vienna. And what it urges them to do is to call the building registration office. And in fact, the building registration office and many, many other authorities had to liaise with Eichmann's Central Immigration Office. And what it urges them to do is to let the building registration office know about any Jewish house agents or managers, to report them to the authorities. And I think, for me, the most sinister line is the very last one, "Es wird nicht Ihr Nachteil sein." You won't regret it. It's so insidious, this incitement with bribery to turn on your neighbours, and it's here, in black and white. The scale of theft taking place in Vienna is often described as wild Aryanization, and that describes, I think, something of the atmosphere of what was happening, that it was terrifying, that it was a destruction of civilized values. But there was also, it was chaotic, but at the heart of it, there was also this very deliberate, cold organization that was, at its heart, what was happening at the Central Immigration Office in Vienna. So, where do we come back to Kristallnacht? Well, I think we have to see that, in many ways, Kristallnacht was also about extortion. What lots of us remember is the levy that was imposed on the Jewish community after Kristallnacht. This was something announced by Hermann Göring, but it was very rapidly taken up by Eichmann. And Jews who were processed through the Central Office of Emigration in Vienna, it was almost, in fact, there is a testimony at Eichmann's trial that described it like a factory where a Viennese Jew would report to the Central Office, and they might be a shop owner or a factory owner, and by the time they went through the office, they would emerge with no property, no rights, and instructions to leave on pain of otherwise being arrested and taken to a camp. That was what was happening in the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, and the levy made it so much easier. And because it provided a kind of legal fiction to allow the office to impose limitless fines, essentially, on the Jews of Vienna in order to extract Jewish property. So the scale of inducements and incitements for people to steal from their neighbours, I think, is one of the key ways that we can understand why Kristallnacht was so brutal in Vienna. But there is another factor, and this is the SA. Here you see the brown shirts standing in front of the University of Vienna in March 1938, just after the Anschluss. Now, the SA in Vienna was slightly different in its development from the rest of the Reich, because until 1938, until the Anschluss, the Nazi Party had been banned in Austria. And in fact, about 9,000 brown shirts from Austria, because in fact the Austrian SA was founded in 1922, long before the party was banned in Austria. They had been in Germany, sort of hiding out. And as soon as the Anschluss happened, the SA, who had been from Austria, flooded back into Vienna. And they often had scores to settle. And this is one of the reasons that the Anschluss was so brutal. There was an influx of radicalized Nazis who were trained in street violence from the days of the Weimar Republic. And this is something that was unusual about Vienna compared to the rest of the Reich. So, again, to come back to eyewitness accounts. This is just another photograph. This is what you can see. This is SA as well as SS inspecting this horrible campaign to force Jews to scrub nationalist slogans off the streets of Vienna. But to come back to Kristallnacht, this is a photograph of a burning synagogue. And to all intents and appearances, it doesn't seem like there are any SA in this photograph. There may not be, but it is important to remember that the SA were instructed during Kristallnacht to not wear uniforms. And this was, again, part of the Nazis wanting the impression to be that this was a popular uprising. Now, this wasn't always the case, and both members of the SA and SS did sometimes wear their uniforms. There wasn't always coherent following of orders in the Nazi regime. But nevertheless, many SA did carry out attacks not in uniform. There's evidence in the eyewitness accounts that suggests that it was brown shirts, as opposed to SS or the military, who were the most violent perpetrators. And I wanted to read an account, again, of an anonymous young man again. Many of the accounts submitted to Alfred Wiener were done anonymously because it was so dangerous to be identified with giving this kind of information. That gives an idea of what the SA were doing. In November, on the 9th, SA men showed up at our home. They took away all our money and our jewellery. They ordered me and my father to go to the local group offices. By the time I got home, I found that the nearby temple had been blown up. My father never returned home, and since then I've heard nothing more from him. When I was at the SA offices, new arrivals, often people as old as 70, were obliged to play humiliating games, like Who Wants to Go to Dachau? At the local Jewish school, an acquaintance hanged himself. Many remained missing after that night. Arrests took place randomly. One family in 8 were arrested. Lawyers and doctors were seized in groups, beaten up, forced to join columns, thrashed, forced to sleep in their coats. The next day, many were sent to camps. These are, again, photographs from the library's collections. These are, on the left-hand side, a more representative picture of what happened to the majority of synagogues in Vienna, burning and desecration. On the right-hand side, the Stadttemple at Seitenstettengasse was desecrated, but unlike other synagogues in Vienna, it wasn't burned down. You can see it was smashed up rather than burned down. And I think it's notable that this happened because the reason it wasn't burned down was because it was likely that neighbouring apartments owned by non-Jews would also burn down. Again, it shows the premeditated, planned nature of these attacks. It was considered whether or not it would put non-Jews at risk, which is, again, a horrible thought. Just at the end of the previous eyewitness account, it described how many were arrested and taken to camps, primarily Dachau. And you can see on these two pictures, on the left, you can see that many shops were looted. This is something that happened across the Reich in places like Berlin, as Anne's reading a testimony showed. One thing that was different in Vienna compared to Berlin, according to eyewitness accounts, is that it was more common in Vienna that private homes were looted. And one of the reasons that didn't happen as much in Berlin, again, coming back to the premeditated nature of this, is that the authorities in Berlin were concerned that Jews of foreign nationality might end up having their apartments ransacked. And some of the authorities were concerned about diplomatic repercussions, which is a strange thing to think when war was looming. But no such restraint was shown in Vienna, as it happens, and a much larger number of private homes of Jewish families were looted in Vienna. So I just want to come back to a second as I move towards the conclusion, to come back to the assassination which triggered Kristallnacht. And Herschel Greenspan was driven to this violent act by the expulsion of his parents among the Polish Jews in Germany at that time who were forced across the border. And I think, again, part of the terror that was the purpose of Kristallnacht was to show that brutal treatment without limit could be dealt out to Jews regardless of their citizenship. I think the other important point to note, and this is a picture of Ernst von Rath's coffin being brought to Germany on the 17th of November 1938. And I think it reminds us that Kristallnacht didn't end on the 10th of November. Days of terror continued thereafter. And although there were lulls, it led on to a terrible escalation. It was a prelude to much worse. So I've drawn my talk from typewritten eyewitness accounts, and I wanted to just, before I conclude my analysis, I just wanted to tell you about those. So 350 eyewitness accounts were gathered by the founder of the Wiener Library, Alfred Wiener, in the days and months after Kristallnacht, and they're the most extraordinary source, written in the present tense, as you've heard from my talk this evening. And they just give such a vivid impression of how awful these events were. So, I want to give a sense now of why I think this is important. I think we need to understand both the reasons for extreme violence and also where extreme violence leads. And really that's what leads me to the exhibition at the library, which focuses really more on the relationship between Vienna and the Shoah than it does on Kristallnacht. This story doesn't end with Kristallnacht. And again, that's why I would really encourage you to visit the library's exhibition, which is launching tomorrow. These are a couple of photographs that are featured in the exhibition, and on the left is Baldur von Schirach, and he was Gauleiter of Vienna from October 1940. And in August of that year, he attended a private dinner in Adolf Hitler's apartment in Berlin, at which Baldur von Schirach put forward his ambitious plan to make Vienna the first city in the Reich free of Jews. This was over a year before the notorious Wannsee Conference. And just over a year later, still before the Wannsee Conference, the first train deporting a large group of Jews from Vienna to Litzmannstadt, Łódź, departed. And the reason this is featured in the exhibition is not because this was the first large-scale deportation from Vienna. There had actually been others earlier that year. But This was the first of a series of transports that happened across the Reich on subsequent days, so that almost every day for a period of weeks, 1,000 Jews were deported from Vienna, from Prague, from Berlin, and in a matter of weeks, 20,000 Jews from across the Third Reich had been deported to Litzmannstadt in Poland. So, to the extent that men like Heydrich and Eichmann could gather in Wannsee and plan the final solution, they knew that this could be implemented because of what had begun in Vienna. I don't want to, although I've argued that the Nazis were the reason that violence was especially extreme in Vienna, I don't want to finish with the Nazis, because we are here to remember and begin our remembrance with remembering the victims of these awful atrocities. So, I want to conclude by remembering Esther and Benjamin Tutte. And we have a photograph of them here with their children, Rita and Kurt. This was taken in Brussels, but they were from Vienna. Benjamin Tutte owned a small shop for school supplies and toys in Vienna's Leopoldstadt district. He was arrested during the November pogrom, and after he was released from Dachau, he fled to Belgium, first without his wife and children. But Esther, Rita, and Kurt were able to find a way to follow after. However, the Nazis caught up with them and invaded Belgium. Following the Nazi occupation, their flat in late 1941 was raided. The parents were arrested, but they managed to hide the children in the apartment. The children were then found by a neighbor who, with the help of the Jewish resistance in Belgium, managed to hide them. However, Esther and Benjamin, the parents, were deported from Belgium to Auschwitz, and they were murdered there. This is a picture of a young man. His name is Maxi Reich, and you can see his name on one of these terrible lists of deportations. But what strikes us first is the postcard, which is a photograph of Maxi standing proudly in front of one of the church spires of Vienna. And he was involved in a youth Zionist organization. We don't know a huge amount about Maxi, but we do have this postcard, and it has an incredibly poignant message, which he wrote to his group leader in his Zionist organization. His name was Martin. Dear Martin, my last request before Poland is that you don't forget your Chava, Maxi, your Maxi Reich, Vienna, the 2nd of March 1941. This history is, of course, deeply tragic. Occasions like today are so important to honor the memory of the victims of the Shoah and the victims of Kristallnacht. We need to understand the reasons for extreme violence and where extreme violence leads. Today, we live in a world where Jews are being singled out and publicly harassed in a way that I've never seen before in my lifetime. It's so important that we remember, that we bear witness, but also that we act together in solidarity. Thank you so much for listening. And I really would love to invite you to visit the Vienna Holocaust Library and to see our exhibition, The Vienna Model of Radicalisation, Austria and the Shoah, which will be running from tomorrow until the 13th of February, 2023. Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Simpson, I'd like to thank you most sincerely on behalf of all of us here, all online, all who will be looking at the recording on YouTube, for talking about the swiftness and the brutality of the incitements within Vienna. And some of the numbers are really quite extraordinary, that there were 200,000 Jews in Vienna, and how many left Vienna so very quickly. I was very struck also by the number of refugees the United Kingdom took, the most number, even beating the United States, 31,000. There's definitely, I think, a lesson for us to learn today. So Dr. Timpson will take a few questions. If you have questions, I will bring a microphone to you. Or if
My name is Paul Secher. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I was just wondering, actually, it's interesting that from the date of the Angelus in March 38 until, I suppose, July, August 39, a lot of the Jews who came to England came in 1939, and I'm just wondering how they managed to survive so long, for a year or more, after so much had been confiscated and conditions were so bad, actually. It must have been extremely difficult.
Yes, it certainly was. And I think there were extraordinary efforts on the part of the Jewish community in Vienna to provide mutual support. And indeed, one of the few groups that were exempted from deportation were those working often with very little pay or no pay for the Jüdische Gemeinde in Vienna. And I think that speaks to the fact that as Jews were dispossessed, as they were forced into ghettoized areas, the support of the wider Jewish community was essential. But again, there's a tragic dimension to this, because increasingly the Nazis forced the Jewish community organization to participate in various ways in the registration of Jews and in the administration of what ultimately became imprisonment and deportation. And that's what is often referred to in Holocaust studies as choiceless choices, that people were pushed to such a point of terror and dispossession that they were left with little or no choice, or had to face choices where there were no good options. So people often had to resort to the black market, to doing their best to hide valuables. Even though this is a space of a few months, there was still a certain gradualness to it, in that things got worse from day to day and from week to week. So I think that's a very good question. And it's actually not easy to understand how people survived. And I think one of the things that's deeply tragic about the situation of Austrian Jews was that there were so... the rapidity of it brought chaos in many senses too. And so it could be very small circumstances that made the difference between someone getting out, getting their papers in time, having enough food and shelter to survive, and not. It was all on a knife edge.
Dr. Simpson, there's a question from Karen Newman.
Thank you very much. Magnificent lecture. Thank you so much. And it's certainly the first time for me to have an opportunity to learn and also to contextualize things that Anne and Bob say within so many of the important issues that you were raising. I have one question. It was about the Austrian nationalists that you mentioned, and seeing kind of Österreich. And obviously I'm familiar with what you said about the kind of nonsense about them being Hitler's first victim. But my question is, were there signs of any solidarity between the Austrian nationalists and what was happening to the Jewish Austrians?
Yes, well, one of the phenomena that I didn't talk very much about was the referendum prior to the Anschluss, because it's not as directly relevant to Kristallnacht. But one of the reasons for the Anschluss and for Hitler making the move of annexing Austria was to crush a kind of a flourishing nationalist movement where, Austria under Schuschnigg it's often referred to as a clerical fascist regime, so it was a very far-right regime, but nevertheless, as the Nazi Party became more established, more liberal Austrian nationalists saw the Schuschnigg regime often, not always, as the lesser of two evils. And so a referendum was called at the beginning of 1930, or Schuschnigg rather, threatened to call a referendum which would assert Austria's independence. And Hitler did not like that one bit, and he threatened that if Schuschnigg didn't cancel the referendum, Austria would be annexed. And so there was this sort of brief flourishing of pro-Austria independence expression in Vienna as well, and that's why there was this graffiti around Vienna, sort of asserting Austria's independence. But politically, Austria was very divided in that sense, and had been for many years. And perhaps it's also worth noting that, I suppose, the fragmentation of politics at this time. There was also an important social democratic movement in Austria and also a communist movement in Austria, neither of which wanted anything to do with the Schuschnigg regime. And there was also, again, a more liberal idea of young Austria, which flourished during the war with the government in exile. And after the war, I think that was a legacy that Austria was keener to celebrate. People who were forced out of Austria as liberals or elite Democrats, and who sort of constructed an identity for Austria that became possible to realize, I suppose, although it was very, very imperfect for a long, long time. It still is. That was liberal democratic. So it's a complicated picture, but there was a strand of Austrian nationalism that was not fascist.
But was there any sign of solidarity with the Jews?
That's another very good question. I think there certainly examples of solidarity between non-Jews and Jews in Vienna, manifested in all sorts of complicated ways. But I suppose that I'm not aware of any example of sort of concerted resistance or demonstrations of solidarity in Vienna between March and November 1938. But I could stand to be corrected on that.
Bob.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very informative talk. You showed a file of TypeScript depositions. Are they included in Ruth Levitt's book, Pogrom?
That's right. Ruth Levitt was a volunteer at the library who translated those very accounts.
Well, it's in the LJS library. So
that's wonderful. Oh, that's good to know.
If anyone wants to read more, it's there.
That's wonderful. I'm really pleased to know that. So I worked closely with Ruth. Before she did that project, the accounts that I read out tonight in my talk, they were only available in German. And she gathered a group of volunteers, many of whom are still working with the library today, who translated them all. And it's an amazing piece of work. And I'm very, very grateful to her. And actually, it's a nice thing to remember her this evening, because she was very dedicated to keeping the memory of the Shoah alive at the library, and I'm tremendously grateful to her. So yes, look for that book in the LJS library.
Are there any other questions? So I think if there aren't, it remains for me to say a huge thank you to you, Dr. Simpson, for being with us here tonight. I mean, it's a disturbing subject, but it's also really illuminating. And I think the more that I listen to you, the more I realize how important it is for ourselves to educate ourselves, continue to educate ourselves about these specific details. And particularly powerful, I think, are those witness statements that are immediate.
Yes.
They're not with any hindsight. And certainly, as you mentioned, Ruth's book, those witness statements are extremely shocking and disturbing the more you read of them. But thank you so much for sharing the documents, for sharing the photographs, for sharing your own learning. And I hope you'll be back again sometime in the future with more lectures and more illuminations. And I hope people will visit the exhibition as well at the Vienna Holocaust Library. Can I say thank you to you, Bob and Anne, to Manuela, to Ellen and Richard for reading in the service this evening. To you, Tammy, thank you so much for bringing your beautiful voice into our service this evening, and Kirill for saving the day with the cameras. And thank you for being here. And I think there might be some tea and coffee and biscuits. Is it still out there? Please stay, talk, help yourself to some tea and coffee. And once again, thank you so much for being with us.